annual Schools Forum training event. What we're going to do this evening is we've got, if you can just jump onto the next slide, please, Karen. Myself and Laura are going to be setting out the powers and responsibilities of Schools Forum to give you a bit of background there, and also talk around children's services funding. We'll have the option after that for a very quick comfort break if you want it. We might just want to carry on and plough through the slides, and then we're going to hand over to Tony, Martin and Joe, who will discuss the educational context that Schools Forum are making some of its decisions in this year. What we'll try and do is keep the presentation as concise as possible to ensure that we finish on time, and we'll circulate the slides afterwards for future reference. The presentation pack has been prepared so that you can refer to this later, so we'll not be going through all of the detail on every single slide tonight. But what I would do is I would recommend that you circulate this pack to your governing body members, bit of CPD for them as a way of raising awareness of Schools Forum and also Dudley's current educational landscape. So if I can just take you onto, if you just jump 2 slides for me onto slide 4, please, Karen. Lovely. That's it, great. Right, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's just really for noting a bit of background as an introduction for maybe those members that are new to education. And it just sets out the role of the Department for Education, or the DFE, and the Education and Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA. What you'll see in some of the reports that we circulate is that these acronyms are used frequently, and when we're presenting reports at Forum, you know, we use those abbreviations. But very briefly, in a nutshell, the DFE are responsible more for the quality and the monitoring of education, whereas the ESFA support the DFE as the funding agency, including sort of the issuing of budgets and delivery of capital programmes. So we in accountancy deal with the ESFA more so than the DFE. So just jumping onto the next slide, please, Karen. Right then, so Schools Forum has its own constitution and is governed by its own regulations, which set out things like its membership requirements, how often it meets, and also its powers around decision making. So it must meet at least 4 times a year, and since the pandemic, it's now got the powers to carry out its business via virtual meetings on a permanent basis. And we had a vote sort of at the end of last academic year to kind of put more virtual meetings in because the attendance was much higher, and we will have face-to-face meetings for those matters that really need a good debate. So that's kind of how we'll carry out our business going forward. So the main role for Forum is to support the Director of Children's Services in relation to strategic financial matters. However, the Forum needs to understand the wider educational context and the perspective of the local authority. So what we're doing is every year we're sharing more and more information with Schools Forum members to help you better make those decisions that we're coming to you and asking you for your advice or your opinion on. So the Forum is supported by a number of key local authority officers, with Helen Ellis acting as the lead officer in her role as the Service Director for Early Help, Schools and SEND. Catherine Driscoll attends as the Director of Children's Services, and Martin Palfreman as the Head of Education Outcomes and Inclusion, as well as other supporting officers such as Karen from Democratic Services, myself and Laura from Finance, and Tony, who's on the meeting today around SEND, and other officers like Joe and anyone else that needs to come along and help present some of these reports. So the meetings of Schools Forum are public meetings, and they can be attended by members of the public as part of that democratic process. We also invite the lead member for Children's Services and the lead member for Children's Services Scrutiny Committee. So that's all part of the process there. Now, no local authority officer or member of the public or members have any voting rights. Only the elected Schools Forum members have voting rights. So if I could just take you on to the next slide, please. Okay then, so as part of your role on forum, you will have a decision-making role in certain matters, as well as advisory and consultative role. The forum is supported by Budget Working Group, which is a technical group formed of all of the head teacher members from forum, and is led by Helen Ellis as the lead officer. So this group meets a week before schools forum meetings, and they will discuss the reports and the details of anything else that that is needed at that time. And some examples of that are changes to funding matrix for children with SEND. Those items are debated and worked through, and we can also have ad hoc meetings there that fall outside of that pattern of schools forum meetings if they're needed. So the next two slides really give some examples of matters whereby we have sort of a consultative role from forums, such as looking at minimum funding and guarantee exclusions, or any changes to how the formulas are allocated. And then in terms of decision making, if you just jump onto that next slide. Um, we also, we come to forum to help make decisions around de-delegations, top slices to the schools block, which is quite an interesting one and quite topical at the moment. So we ask you to help us make those decisions. So if we just jump onto the next slide, my final slide really is, which we thought would be useful to share with you, just gives you an idea of some of those reports that require members to make decisions on them, and the timescales of those meetings when those reports get discussed. What we have there are the meetings are set really in line with when we need to set the budgets for the dedicated schools grant for the DSG. So they're quite prescriptive and quite rigid really, to allow us to get all the permissions that we need in a timely order to be able to send out the budgets to schools and to education providers. So just a couple of points to note really around the de-delegated service approvals. You'll see there that the decision makers are really the maintained members, and that is because only their budgets are impacted by that decision that's within that report. So academy members and different other members there wouldn't get a voting right in that on that paper. And then another point to make is around the Secretary of State disapplication requests, which can be for a number of things. These matters are voted by schools forum members, and there's a real significant weight held by that vote. But the regulations do give the local authority final decision making powers via the Director of Children's Services on whether or not to proceed with a disapplication request to the Secretary of State. So, but what that person does do, if the local authority makes that decision to progress to the Secretary of State, regardless of the discussion at forum, is that the Secretary of State does take into account how the forum has voted. So there is quite a heavy weight there, and its rationale for doing so. So it's really key that whether you vote for or against something, it's really important for you to get your feelings noted at the meetings and in those minutes, so that the Secretary of State can see reasons for or against those decisions. So some examples whereby we've had to apply to the Secretary of State, as I mentioned in the slide earlier, around top slice in the schools block budget to move some of that funding over the 0.5% that the schools forum can vote on. That can go to the Secretary of State. And also if we want to change the scheme for financing schools, our local scheme, then again, if schools forum members don't agree with us and the local authority truly thinks it's for the greatest good of all schools, then it can still go ahead. So those are just a couple of examples that have come up in recent years. But what you will see from the reports is that it's really clear from the recommendation section of the schools forum reports whether the item is for information only or whether it is for members to vote on. And Karen, as part of Democratic Services, and Remley as chair, take us through that voting procedure really quite easily, quite clearly. So yes, in a nutshell, that is pretty much those big key hitting decisions that Schools Forum will be asked to make a judgment on, really. Okay, so on that point then, I'm just going to hand over to Laura and we're going to talk through the Children's Services funding. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacey. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? I'm getting nods.
Yep,
Good, great. Can you skip to the next slide, please, Karen? So this is the Children's Services revenue budget for 21-22, and in total we have a budget in excess of £360 million. And you can see from that diagram there that the biggest proportion is the dedicated schools grant. If you look at the other two blue sections and the green section, combined they add up to 18.1 million, and that's basically the remit that Helen Ellis has from a general fund perspective. And what we mean by general fund is the main council budget. So the areas that make up that are family solutions, education outcomes and transport. So the other sections of the budget that you can see there are predominantly children's social care, and that's approximately £50 million that you've got there. Karen, could you move on, please? Thank you. So in addition to that, we have a number of local authority grants that we receive. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it does just give you a flavour of the sort of grants that come through the local authority. Now, for this year in particular, the School Improvement Brokerage Grant has been ring-fenced, and that dictates that sort of the amount of money that we get is the amount of maintained schools that we have in the local authority. As you can probably guess, we've had a lot of COVID-related grants over the past 2 years. So I'm not going to name them all, but you'll be familiar with a lot of them. So there was the COVID catch-up grant, there was the local support programme and the holiday activities grant. So we've been monitoring those, and we are, for the majority of the grants on that list, we have to complete a grant return that is certified by the Section 151 officer. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is the latest allocation for the DSG. So for this year, we have 287.7 million in total. There's 4 discrete funding blocks, and we have to ensure that we account for expenditure within those blocks, and we also budget for the expenditure. We're not allowed to transfer within blocks. So to give you an example, the schools block is ring fenced. So if we want to transfer from that block up to 0.5%, we have to have approval from Schools Forum. So that ties into what Stacey was saying earlier. Anything over that, we have to go to the Secretary of State for approval. Can I have the next slide, please? So just to give you a bit more information around the schools block, it is a ring fence block. It's funding for pre-16 schools, and we delegate that funding based on the national funding formula. Now, we are moving towards a hard formula nationally. They've deferred that now until 23-24, but the good news for us in Dudley is that we've been mirroring that national funding formula for the past 2 years now. So we shouldn't see a huge implication for Dudley with regards to that. The schools block funds maintain schools and academies, and it also funds growth funding. So for this financial year, we've received 751,000, which has supported growth in pupils in year. We do have local discretion over how we spend that money, and the methodology and criteria is agreed annually with Schools Forum. So next week, a report will be presented at Schools Forum where members will be able to vote on that. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is a very simple diagram of how we calculate the funding formula. I've just seen a note that's come up. Yes, you'll get all the slides following the presentation. Yeah, so that will help with making notes. So, yeah, I've tried to do it as simple as I can because you can imagine when you look at the technical guidance, it can be a little bit complicated. But in essence, we have various funding factors within the formula and funding streams, whereby we have a unit of resource that's dictated by the ESFA. So, for instance, deprivation funding will have a unit of resource. We apply that in the formula based on the number of pupils in each school, and then we arrive at an overall individual school's budget per school. The ESFA also prescribe a minimum per pupil funding, which for next year, the rate is £4,265 for primary schools and £5,525 for secondary. So when we set the budget, we have to ensure that a pupil in a school does not receive funding below that threshold. We also have minimum funding guarantee that is set by the ESFA, and that's set between 0.5% and 2% for this year and for next year. And just to give everyone a little bit more information on that, for this financial year, we set a minimum funding guarantee of 1.26%, which meant that no school would see increases below that level. And for information for everyone, 28 schools benefited from that, of which 27 of those were primary schools this year. Can I have the next slide, please? So the other funding block is the Central School Services block. So funding's allocated on a historic and an ongoing basis. The historic funding is cash limited and has been from the start. It's reduced over the past 2 years and it will continue to reduce. So next year we're seeing a reduction on our provisional allocation of about £90,000. Just to give you an example of what's funded through that historic funding stream, the combined budgets now. Schools Forum do vote on the combined budgets and a report actually comes to Forum in February. That's funded through this historic funding stream. On an ongoing basis, some of the areas that are funded from this area is the admission service and the statutory services. And for the first time this year, the Teachers' Pay and Pensions grant for centrally retained staff was already also included within this allocation. And you can see at the bottom there, we had £2 million for 21-22. Okay, thank you. So the high needs block. So for 21-22, the allocation is 39.9 million. It funds SEND from 0 to 25, alternative provision and inclusion services. So the education, health and care plans dictate how much we pay to providers for top-up funding. And as Stacey said earlier, we've had a massive review of funding this year, and we introduced the matrix with the SEND team. And Tony will be going into more detail around what that means later on in the presentation. The biggest part of the high needs block is provision. Basically, we pay for provision, and the way that we distribute funding to provision is referred to as place plus methodology. Can we move on, please, Karen? Thank you. So what this table attempts to do is to explain how we distribute funding to provision. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing because you will have these slides, but the basis for funding is that place funding is equivalent to roughly the first £10,000 and top-up funding is everything above that 10,000. So to just give you the first example for maintained schools and academies, the first £10,000 is included within their budget share. We often refer to the budget share as the individual schools budget or the ISB. So that 10,000 includes the pupil funding, which we refer to as ORPU, and the notional SEN budget. And then everything over and above that is agreed after a review of the EHCPs and distributed based on the matrix. The matrix was introduced from September 2021. The other, just to go through special schools as well, because that funding also changed from April of this year, is that now what we do is we pay based on a unit cost per school, and that's referred to as provision and needs-led funding. So it's defined and calculated based on the individual designation and unique characteristics of each school. Okay, so you will get this slide, so you will see the rest. So can we move on, please? Thank you. So the early years block. So this is approximately £19 million this year. So it funds 2, 3 and 4-year-olds. There is an early years formula for mainstream and PVIs. That formula includes universal entitlement, which is up to 15 hours per week per child, and the extended entitlement, which increases to 30 hours per week per child. We've got an inclusion fund that's funded from this allocation, and for this year it's set at £120,000, and that's for emerging SEN needs. The central early years expenditure is also funded from here. That is predominantly the early years foundation stage advice team, but it also includes a contingency to support with termly payments for 2, 3 and 4-year-olds in provision. Now, in light of COVID, there has been real changes in the funding approach this year. Previously, the allocation was only amended twice based on the January census. But in light of what's happened, the government have issued new guidelines around how we receive the funding, and it's based on a termly census that coincides with the school census return that we have to get signed off and certified by the Section 151 officer. The next return is due the middle of December. Okay. Oh, sorry, can you go back? Oh, you're going back. Thank you. Thanks, Karen. So we wanted to give you some information on the policy changes. Now, I've mentioned the hard formula for the national funding formula that's now been deferred. There's a consultation that's currently out that was released in July that closes this week, and it goes into more detail around what the hard formula means locally. It also goes into detail around growth funding and removes potentially by removing the local discretion around that. It looks at the central schools block and the changes that we may see as a result of that. And there's also a suggestion that we align the financial year for maintained schools and academies. So we're doing a joint response with Coventry, and also I believe it's a regional response as well, to respond to that consultation. So we'll let you know the outcome of that when we receive it. So going back to schools will receive their 22-23 budgets by the end of February 2022. We have received provisional allocations for next year, but we won't receive the final allocation until December. It does look positive for schools. Some of the units of resource that I explained earlier in the formula have increased by 3% compared to 21-22. High needs block is also positive for us, but obviously we need to do a lot of work on that before we declare how much the allocation is and what impact it has on the financial recovery. Unfortunately, the central schools block has reduced for next year by approximately £90,000. And in light of the national and local pressures that we have with regards to the high needs block, the ESFA have launched a management tool, which is a template to support local authorities in their recovery of the deficits within the high needs block. We're in the process of completing that, and we shared that with Budget Working Group earlier today. However, it's very much driven by strategy and demand, not finances. So we have promised Schools Forum that we will be presenting the management tool on a regular basis, and we're trying to present that. We're attempting to present it at the 16th of November forum meeting, so you'll see more information there. And at that point, I'm going to hand back to Stacey. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Right, okay. So really around some of that context then that you'll be making decisions in this year is that we have significant pressures on the dedicated schools grant, as Laura has mentioned, particularly on the high needs block. And the guidance is really clear that this is a DSG problem. You know, the local authority can't step in and put a load of money in to wipe off any deficits without Secretary of State approval. So there's significant pressures there. So there'll be some decisions potentially that are needed this year, next year, going forwards around those management actions that Schools Forum members will be asked to support on, really. Some of that is around the funding matrix and further review of that. Some of it will be around potential top sizes of the schools block in future years. You know, decisions need to be made and looking at the wider context. And obviously, if we've got an impact with other blocks reducing, with the central school services block reducing, then there'll be implications there as well that Forum will be asked their opinion on. Obviously, we're seeing there's a review continues around hospital education and the impact that has on the DSG. And then we've got pressures around COVID, which I think it's fair to say the whole of the dedicated schools grant has seen pressures in lots of different areas off the back of that. So there's quite a lot going on. And as I say, we are in a position whereby, like other authorities, we are significantly overspent on our DSG, and you will receive regular reports on that going forward. So in a nutshell, that's our presentation completed. So are there any questions that anyone wants to ask of Laura and myself at this point before we move on? No. Oh, sorry. Sorry, you can hear my dogs in the background. Okay, then I'll take that silence as there's no questions then. I mean, we're only half an hour into the presentation, so I think perhaps if we just play on rather than taking a comfort break, and I'll hand over to Tony. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Right, so I'm Tony Dowdew and I'm interim head of SEND, and I'm just going to give you a bit of a SEND context update and progress and next steps. Next slide, please, Karen. So as you're well aware, we had our SEND inspection 2019, and as a result of that, we've had to do a written statement of action. And really, for those that perhaps new to Dudley, I just really wanted to share in terms of our progress. So in black, you'll see I've darkened. We had 132 actions from the 14 areas of improvement that were identified, and 110 are completed and 22 are in progress. So for us, that's good news, because throughout COVID, we've had to carry on doing that progression work in terms of our improvement and working where we could with our colleagues, particularly our health colleagues who were diverted because of COVID, but we've continued with that journey. We do have DFE formal reviews, and we had one last week, and so we're waiting for the feedback. We're hoping that it will be positive and that they will note our progress as well. And we also have undertaken a self-evaluation audit to help us know ourselves. So I just really wanted to give those updates in bold. Next slide, please. This one I'm not going to really dwell on. It was just reminding you that we work to a legislative framework under the Children and Families Act, and so we work to the Code of Practice that was that came out in 2015. So again, this is, you can read at your leisure. But what we wanted to show you, just reminding you that we work through the 4 broad areas as indicated in the blue table below. A number of those we have subsets, so that actually for schools, because the school census, they can see how those subsets overlay onto those 4 areas. Next slide, please. again, it's a national, as you well know, that the move around that the send is a national picture, and I just thought this is always a wonderful slide because it really impacts on what the work that actually finance we're talking about, of how we've got to work together with partners, showing the commissioning cycle, but also how we work to make sure that we work in collaboration and that we're picking up from a strategic approach all the way down to an individual. And I always find this a really useful diagram because it just reminds us actually in the way that we need to work. And when we lose focus, actually we can see what happens at the bottom when we're not able to place young people into the right placements, and we're having to spend a lot of our money sending children to out of borough very expensive placements. So the commissioning cycle and the need for demand management is a key driver within the SEND agenda, and it really is important for us to remember that because of the money that's actually at stake if we get this wrong. Next slide. So I thought just in terms of operations, our team has grown since I think last did this presentation to you. So I think when we last came, we were 11 case officers. In bold, you can see we are 14 case officers. So thank you, Finance, for the extra money in order to get those workers in, because it's been really important, partly to do with the volume of work that's coming through the front door. And, it's trying to get our practice embedded and work to ensure that we've got a really graduated response at the front door from an early identification of needs. So if we get that right and work very closely with our mainstream schools, then we can have a lot more children within our mainstream, children within our special schools, but vacancies within there. So we're not sending our young people out. So that's the importance of having enough staff so that we can do that work operationally. It's really important. I thought what was also important was just to also share with you that some data around EHCP. So the high needs block is there to facilitate and support the high needs block. But as you can see, we are nearly 3,000 EHCPs. So for a small borough like ourselves, we really need to take note of this. And we are seen as an outlier at the moment. I think we're in the top 20 of those that have got too many EHCPs. So there is work that we need to do to consider what that is about and how can we instill confidence in schools to work at a lower level, identifying but still meeting their needs within schools, but also to give parents assurance that the needs of their child could be met at SEND support level. But we are worried about the numbers that are increasing, and we have to think about what that impact will be, as Stacey was acknowledging in that consideration slide. Some really good news around our tribunal management, though. We've seen a 22% reduction in tribunals. So in August, there were 20 tribunals as opposed to 58 last year, and that is because we have a dedicated tribunal officers working with the courts, working with parents, and where we don't need to go to tribunal, working in terms of achieving consent orders. So that's really good because that's around the co-production with families and having a different take and being much more clear about how we can ensure we can get young people into the right setting. We've also, the timeliness is improving, so we're 47% in 2021 as opposed to last year where we were 22%. So we really are improving. The national picture is 58%. So actually, if we keep our trajectory, we should be hitting and passing the national and beyond. The important thing is to make sure actually that the EHCPs are fit for purpose. They are clearly identifying what the needs of the young person are, and that schools can meet those needs, and that we could be in a place where a young person does meet and achieve their outcomes, and actually an EHCP can be ceased earlier than anticipated. It would be great to be in that position. We're not there yet, but it'd be great to be in that position that we could do that. We are also completing on average 5 weeks earlier than before as well. So I mean that we are expected to complete our EHCPs within 20 weeks, and we've shifted within that 18 months and really working hard to make sure we can get to the 20 weeks, and we monitor that on a daily and weekly basis to make sure that we don't miss a deadline. So if we can keep on our trajectory around the 47%, then we will start to actually complete good EHCPs within the 20 weeks going forward as well. We've been given the agreement for a new SEND case management system, and this is about us being more digital in the way that we work, trying to move away from paper-based paperwork and recording to a much more electronic system, and that will improve our timeliness as well, because paperwork we've done within the system. But that portal, that new case management, will allow us to have a portal type approach going forward, when other partners can also send in their information, and hopefully in the future we can have parents also being involved in that. So that's a welcomed really increase, and given the pandemic and the way that we have to work much more in a digital world, this makes sense. It's the right way to be going forward. Annual reviews is one of our areas that we need to work harder on to improve, but we've got that as our action plan going forward, and the expectation is that we'll be much more on time and within and be compliant within the annual review process. Next slide, please. Just quickly around some strategic developments as well. So we our new governance arrangements are through the new director for education, health and schools and SEND framework is in place. So we've moved away over the year to really just making sure that we're working under Helen's directorate, bringing in education, working with family solutions, really thinking about how we should be working together. Often SEND sits on its own, and sometimes it's a lonely place to be. It's like a Cinderella service. The important thing is about bringing it to be part of an inclusive world and working closely with Martin and Joe through education outcomes, so that we get education for all children, including those for SEND as well. So I think that's an important development that we're doing this year, and that we're also looking at around having our own education performance clinic to help us be on target, making sure that we're driving good data, using the intelligence and the data to help us shape our work. And Laura's so clear that the management action plan is about strategy and is about data. The finance follows once we've actually got those plans in a particular way. So really looking forward to working with that in a particular way. We are undertaking deep dive exercise with our DfE advisors to prepare us for our inspection. We know that because of the pandemic, we didn't get our revisit in 2020. We expect that it won't be probably in 2021, but we anticipate in 2022 we will get our revisit. So we need to prepare ourselves around those 14 areas. We're on the journey, we've started that work, but we need to be prepared to get that really significant progress tick that we know that we've been working so hard on. And just in bold, I just wanted to just outline some new partnership groups that we've got. So we've got Futures is the young people's participation group. Really excited about having young people forming and working with us, sense checking what we're putting out there to make sure from a young person's point of view it's making sense and that their voices can be heard. The Parent Carer Forum has been a welcome development as well, working a lot more closely. And for those of you that might be involved or coming to the SEND strategy launch, you'll see how we've worked closely in collaboration with our parent carers to make sure we have a strategy that's fit for purpose, but everybody feels have contributed to. And the local office steering group is a welcome new group as well, which is also multi-agency, and it's co-hosted with the parent group, and that's really important because that's a window to the local authority. Our inspectors will look on that to get a sense of Dudley, and it's important that that's a really right a local offer that shows what we're doing, and that they can feel and be assured that we know where we're going in terms of our SEND work. Next slide, please. So money, matrix funding update. I borrowed your slide. I like the way it came across, so I borrowed it. Oh, it's gone back. Sorry. So the matrix funding, it was really important, and we recognise that we have been bold here. We've moved to a new funding arrangement. We used the summer to test it out on the sort of exceptional funding cases, and we really want to be able to ensure that there is money in the system for mainstream schools to work with some of our most complex children. That's a really important development. Our rollout started really, as Laura had indicated, in the April with the special schools, and from the 1st of September we're working with our mainstream and academies for those 840 children that have got EHCPs to move over from banded over into the matrix. Next slide, please. just some of the detail. The summer was really helpful for us. It gave us a real opportunity to understand the mechanics that we needed to have in place around the matrix. After the consultation from March, we did update the matrix to a version 9. We looked at the descriptors and we started to work with that. We did some consultation. We went to visit the parent care group to explain what this new approach was. We did training with our staff. We had drop-ins with schools in terms of heads and senkos coming in to understand what this matrix was all about. And then we developed and had for the summer period an IMP, and that was an internal moderation panel where all those cases came through and we could look at them and review and really understand the operations of the matrix. Sometimes it was very painful, wasn't it, Laura, around this, because we had to have some real deep discussions about how can we manage this process. We had done some extrapolations beforehand, but it really, as you well know, it's in the doing and in the implementation of any new development that you really see it working in practice. And those were some really difficult questions about how can we manage this process and try to keep to the budget, because that was what was a key point around that as well. So, but during the summer, we've done 170 cases that had been moderated through the panel, and those were both exceptional but cases that would have been normally coming through panel in terms of summer reviews as well. We talked around that there might be children who, for the current matrix, in terms of the top level, it's from level 1 to 7, that there might be children whose needs, because of their high medical needs or some of their behavioural emotional needs, may not sit very neatly within the matrix. And we had a lot of internal discussions about what that would look like, whether we would have to split, level 7 in A, B, C, D. But we actually came up with having a person-centred targeted funding approach where there was evidence to demonstrate that the provision that was required was more than a level 7, that we would then cost that out and then give the difference to the schools so they had enough money in order to keep those young people in mainstream, because we recognise that we have more children within the mainstream. It frees up our special schools, which means that we're not sending children out of borough. Next slide, please. So at the end of the summer, when we reviewed all the feedback, we started to develop a new update the matrix to a version 10. We re-looked at the descriptors and we re-looked at the point allocation and distribution, and we changed those accordingly. We recognise still that there's still some areas around column B and column F, and that's around the ASD and the social emotional mental health. They still present some sort of tweaking that we need to do, that we're going to be looking at currently going forward to make sure that we are capturing those young people's needs and that they are funded appropriately going forward. We're also looking at the person-centred targeted funding approach for those handful of children that may need above and beyond the level 7, because we recognise that there are children like that whose families really want them to be within the mainstream, and so do we. So that, again, it's important that we think about how we can manage and support them. And we've looked at the we have a review schedule, so we're going to be reviewing the matrix in December, March, and we're going to then have an annual review in the June, so that we've got the updated matrix for September 22, so that we keep it live. One of the things that we realised with the old banding framework, it was never reviewed. This time around, we don't want to fall into that trap. We need to make sure that the matrix has enough money to ensure that children and young people can be supported within mainstream appropriately. And we, with all the other developments that are happening through education outcomes, and looking at what we can do with our specialist inclusion service, how they can wrap around as well. In terms of what can be available to schools, we know going forward we'll be able also to work differently around the matrix as well. So we have spent to date on the 177 that have been moderated just over 575,000. And Laura may just come in just to say how much we have put aside for the matrix in terms of making sure there's money. Laura, do you want to do that now?
Yeah, of course. So we set aside 1.7 million. That was at the time we thought that was quite a prudent estimate, but as Tony has said, when you extrapolate and you do quite a small dip sample, we did a dip sample of about 200 cases. you know, we thought that would be enough. But obviously, following the moderation over the summer and after looking at the cases so far, we could need an extra £1 million on top of that as a full year effect. But we'll know more when we actually come to do the estimates, probably around the end of October. And we'll share that information with forum members
Yeah.
as soon as we know.
And we had also realised that we had started, when we started the matrix, we were working with those that actually were exceptional funding. So they were getting above and beyond in any event. Some of the young people coming through panel now are very much those, and perhaps maybe in the median. So they're the ones that are probably level 5 and below. So it'd be interesting, won't it, Laura, to see as we move forward how that pans out. But managing the matrix, what we've decided to make sure is that we've got a log of issues that are coming through panels so that we can keep those. That will help us tweak the matrix as we go along. Hopefully there won't be big material changes that we have to do, but if we have to do them, we have to do them, because we need to have a funding model that is fit for purpose, and that works for everybody. So we're using that log issue as a way to do that. So we'll review what issues have been raised since we started since 1st of September, probably just after half term. We are very clear that by having done the matrix, it's also made us relook at the EHCP, particularly around section F, which is around provision, and the person-centred targeted funding has really helped us hone in that it's important within the EHCP that we need to be specific and quantifiable in order to be working out what provision is needed for a young person. So actually it's helped us relook at our paperwork and our processes and the things that we have to do with those that contribute to the EHCP process. Next slide. Right, lovely. Oh, I just wanted to end with this slide because it's just about the collaboration. We've got our Send strategy launch on Thursday, and I just thought it was really, you know, when we talk about money, sometimes it feels like doom and gloom because we don't have a lot of money. But actually, what's lovely to see is that sometimes you don't need a lot of money when you're working in an inclusive way with children and young people within our borough. And so I just thought this was a lovely way to end this financial part of my bit as well. So if those of you are coming to the Send strategy, we hope to see you then. For those of you who don't know about it but would like to come, let us know so that you can get your invite and come and celebrate with Dudley for the work that it's doing. So that's the end of my presentation. I don't know if there are any questions. Brian.
Did you say Brian then?
Yeah, I could see your name, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. If you don't mind, congratulations on getting so many of the targets done. And I think it's good, this partnership with health and other groups like social services and so on. But I know this debate has been with head teachers on school forum in the past, that some of those expenses for medical things, social care things, seem to fall on the education budget, either the school's budget or children's services. And do the other groups like health contribute financially to looking after these people, or is that my educational bias that I sort of feel resentment that it's falling to schools? And I know, as I say, head teachers did it. So can you tell me, do they contribute financially as well, or do they just turn up and talk?
No, they do. There is a contribution with social care and health. We do have a high cost and post-16 commissioning panel, which is very tripartite led. So where we've got high cost placements, probably in the main, Brian, is probably where this features. So where we've got high cost placements, sometimes there is a need for both social care and for health to contribute to those. So yes, they do. But I would say that those tend to be for those independent, high cost residential type placements. We are able to get tripartite funding, which is important because I think you're right. In the past, often those were probably saddled with education, but that's not the case now. And where we continue to work with our health colleagues, particularly around equipment, because often, you know, young people are assessed for medical needs, and where it's appropriate, they do fund. The trouble is sometimes they fund at home as well. So if they're funding at home, they're not necessarily going to fund in school because that's seen as an education need. So, but we're working through and developing an equipment policy so we can be clear about where roles and responsibilities are. But yes, you know, that the important thing, it's called an EHCP for a reason, and it's not necessarily always about funding. Sometimes it is about their ability for them to put services in to support families. So there are sometimes there's a need for families maybe to have early help or to have short breaks. That would be a social care need. And so those are where we work very closely about. That's where we can join up the EHCP to make it much more than in a way what could be seen as a very glorified old statement, really, is when we work with our colleagues in a very collaborative way. And we challenge also where sometimes they don't think there might not be a health need. We might challenge that and say, well, we think that there is, and we need them to go and relook at that again.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, reassuring. Thank you.
Okay then, guys. Good afternoon, good evening to people I'm not aware that I've met before on the group. So my name's Martin Pulfreman. I'm new head of education outcomes, effective from the 1st of September. And prior to that, I was actually head teacher at Summerhill School in the borough. You will tell by the accent that I am local. So I've moved across to join the local authority and just wanted to take literally 10 minutes to give you a little bit of an overview in terms of where we're at from education outcomes point of view, and just to really set out the priorities for the next 12 months. Some of my head teacher colleagues who are on the call have seen a lot of this, and this is a condensed version of a main presentation that went out to all heads last week. Okay, next slide then, please. So in terms of where we're at and where we're going, so what we're really keen to do at the moment is develop this idea of a long-term strategy for education through Dudley, and that is an all-encompassing strategy that takes our state-maintained schools, our private providers, our academies on a journey together, really, to establish where we are now and where we want to go and how we're going to get there together, working in partnership. And that's the really crucially important thing, that we do in this together to make a difference to our borough and to the local children and young people within it. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is that we do everything from an openness and an honesty and transparency point of view. And we develop a team, particularly at local authority level, that is very approachable and that is very willing to work with all of our partners to make that difference. I am personally very driven by high expectations. We always do our best. We're always trying to improve ourselves. We're always taking the risk to improve things, and very visible leadership in taking people on that journey. So already in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we've visited more than 20 schools across the authority. Matt Osborne, one of our school improvement officers, has already been into all of our schools that requires improvement to start talking about where they need specific intervention and support, and some evaluation of where they're at. And we will continue doing that with the view that we will have visited every school across the borough by Christmas. My brain works in quite a simple way, as people who are working closely with me already know, and it's about that idea of, Joe's laughing, it's very simple, it's very black and white. We need to be consistent, we need to be effective, we need to be simple in what we do. We can't get tied up in systems and processes that we get lost.
That was ironic.
Oh dear, should we give him a moment? Then we might need to move on to your section, Joe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think he has got lost.
Joe, do you want to go ahead with your section, and then hopefully Martin can come back?
I will do, if that's okay.
Yep, I'll just move to the slide.
Okay, just while we're getting to the slides, I'm Joe Mullins. I'm a senior school improvement officer for the local authority, and one of my roles is that I oversee the running of governor services. What I would say is, The presentation you've got has actually got quite a lot of slides in. I'm not going to go through each of them in detail, but I will talk broadly around each one. And it really is in and around the role of the governor. A lot of this relates to maintained schools. However, academies have their own trust boards, committees, and local governing boards, which work very similarly to the way that we're going to talk about here. There's not a huge number of differences. There are three key functions of governance. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves what those are, and that is ensuring that there's a clarity of vision, ethos, and a strategic direction for the school, holding the leaders of the school to account around educational performance and also the performance management of staff, and also overseeing the financial performance of the school and making sure that money is well spent. Could you go to the next slide for us, please? Okay, the role of the chair of governors is absolutely essential in this. A good working relationship between the chair and the head teacher is pivotal in terms of making governance work effectively. The chair is a leader for the board, and a good chair leads the board really well in terms of those three core functions. There's a note at the bottom there that points out that the chair is actually not able to take actions upon their own unless it's sanctioned by the board. So we have what's called a chair's action. In years gone by, chairs used to have a tendency to act independently. They are simply not allowed to do that unless there is a need to do it in the interests of the school, the pupil, the parents, or a member of staff. So they're not allowed to act independently of the board. Okay, could you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so it's really important that the board has a well-articulated vision, and the suggestion is that that is a written statement. That vision is a touchstone to be revisited through the working of the board. Actually, a lot of boards don't revisit this as often as possibly they should do. They need to have a clear ambition for their pupils, the current pupils they have and the pupils they're going to have in the future, and their school's relationship with other schools. Now, that might be anything from a close working relationship, a federation, right the way through to an academisation. So it's about how your school relates to others. And obviously, in terms of multi-academy trusts, it's about the future of that organisation and whether or not the trust itself is going to choose to grow. Could you move to the next slide for us, please? Okay. There needs to be a strategy in place to try and achieve that vision. It should be costed, and it should be used in terms of setting the priorities and thinking about the accountability and the monitoring that that governors are actually going to do in the school. And it needs to be a backdrop for the decisions that governing boards make. And again, this is a place where the chair of governors has a very key role in terms of bringing governors back to thinking about what are the values, the ethos and the strategic direction of their school. Okay, if you could move to the next slide, please. Okay. It's important that all the individuals within the organisation live up to those values and that ethos that the governing board sets for itself. And that's about the individuals, but it's also about the policies and the practices of the school as well. And it's important that governors are mindful of this when they look at the way the school is functioning. Certain governing boards, particularly schools with a religious character, also have some other objectives that they need to achieve. So there are charitable objectives, and they may have some governing documents that actually dictate how they work. Could you move us to this next slide, please? Okay. Moving to the second key function, holding leaders to account for the educational performance of the school. That's best thought of as a series of questions. So the next few slides here will have a whole series of different questions. This particular set of questions is largely about the performance of pupils, both the highest performing pupils and the lowest performing pupils. Do the school have a credible plan for being able to address that? How are the school going to raise standards for all children? As we know, those standards relate to the quality of teaching. So there's an element in there about boards thinking about what is the quality of teaching, and does the school have a strategy for addressing those areas of weakness? A lot of that is dealt with in a governing board meeting through the head teacher's report to governors. So the head teacher's report to governors is a really key document in terms of laying out what is the school doing in terms of standards. And again, it's a place for the chair of governors to play a very skillful role here and in allowing governors to ask challenging questions of the head teacher. If you could move to the next slide, please. This series of questions is more around what's it like to be a pupil at the school. So is the school a happy place? Does it have a positive learning culture? Also, it talks about attendance, behaviour and bullying. Okay, so it's about governors having a clear idea about that. Safeguarding, which is obviously an essential part of all the work that goes on in schools. It thinks about that wider offer to pupils. So are pupils receiving a broader offer other than just what's within the curriculum? And are they being encouraged to develop healthy and active lifestyles? There's also another section at the bottom here is what do pupils and parents say about the school? So that's a really important factor that governors need to take account of. Could you move to the next slide, please? Okay. This section really sits in and around staff. So does the school have the right structure? Okay, is it structured in the right place, in the right way? Does it have the right people in the right place? Are those people suitably developed through the training programs that the school might put on for its staff? And are they suitably rewarded? So there's elements in here about pay and conditions as well. So it thinks about that structure of is the staffing in the school fit for purpose? Okay, could you move to the next slide, please? Okay, third function is the overseeing of the financial performance of the school. And again, series of questions, but really, is the money being spent in the right places and for the right reasons? Okay, does the school have a very clear 3-year financial plan? Are any risks that there are financially being taken account of? And are there sufficient reserves within the school to develop whatever it is that the school would like to develop either in the current year or in future years? So are there enough reserves being built up there to develop in the way that we want to? Okay, next slide, please. This is in and around budget planning. So is the budget planned based on curriculum planning and the needs of the school, or is it simply a budget based on the previous year's plan, the previous year's budget, and just the need to create a surplus? So is it a bottom-up plan in terms of how the budget is going to be set? How is that budget monitored? So looking and thinking about the financial data and the tools that are being used to do that. Is the school compliant with the basic sort of procurement rules? Okay, and has the school explored its opportunities to collaborate with other schools to potentially generate a more efficient system and to share services or to share costs in some sense? If you could move to the next slide, please. Now, this is one of the roles where a very specific skill is required. So governing boards should try to recruit a governor who has sufficient financial skills to be able to liaise with the school's business manager and to develop an ongoing relationship with them so that they have a very clear understanding of what the school's budget is like and how it is working. It's important that everybody on the governing board has that sort of understanding, but this is one of the places where a very specific skill is required from a particular governor who will liaise with the school in and around the finances. This is actually one of the hardest positions to fill within a governing board, because the number of people coming forward with those sorts of skills is not as high as we'd like. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. Obviously, in an academy, it is the academy trustees that are responsible for those finances and for ensuring that the trust is financially sustainable and viable to go into the future. Obviously, an academy trust has a fair degree of autonomy over and above that which a maintained school has. So it does need to make sure that basically all its financial dealings are up to public scrutiny, shall we say. So there's almost an additional responsibility there for academy trustees to ensure that the accountability in and around finances is what we'd expect it to be. Okay, if you'd move to the next slide, please. Now, this is how governing boards are largely made up. So this is for a maintained school. A trust may have a structure that it chooses for itself, but in a maintained school, you would expect to see at least 2 parent governors, the head teacher, unless they choose not to be a governor. That's actually very rare. A staff governor, a local authority governor, and any number of co-opted governors. There has been a trend in recent years for governing boards to actually decrease in size. They're not as large now. They're not as large now as they have been in the past. Governing boards seem to work quite well at between 10 and 12 members. Seems to work very well. In addition to those members, the governing board can choose to have associate members. So it brings other people onto the governing board who have specific skills in specific areas. Foundation, voluntary aided and voluntary controlled schools have additional foundation and partnership governors over and above the ones that are identified there. Okay, if you could just move to the next slide. Governing boards are generally run by full governing board meetings and then a series of committees. The number and type of committees is up for the governing board to decide for itself, but very typically it might include any of the ones that are on that list there. So finance, standards, curriculum, premises, health and safety, pay. It could well have other ones as well. And another an organisation within the governing board we try to encourage is the idea of ad hoc working groups to look at specific issues. So that's a short-term group that might work for a shortish period of time to look at a specific development. Okay, and we also have specific committees that are convened for purposes like exclusions and complaints. Okay, if you could go to the next slide. Governors strongly encouraged to visit their schools. That's how they're going to see their schools working. That's how they're going to get a clear idea of the day-to-day running of the school and find out how the vision and the ethos that they've set at the outset is being put into practice in terms of the policies that the school is implementing, how the improvement plans are developing, and how that actually pans out. It also gives them an opportunity to talk to pupils, staff and parents, although that isn't a substitute for more strategic and systematic ways of engaging with those stakeholders, but it is a useful point at which governors can talk to those interested parties. Okay, obviously those visits need to have a very clear focus. Okay, and this is not the old-fashioned governors just turning up and coming and visiting the school. What we encourage is very, very clearly a focused visit, looking at some very, very specific aspects of the school's working. Okay, can you move to the next slide, please? There is an expectation that governors will increase their skills levels. Very few people come with all the skill levels that they require. So there really is an obligation on governors to do that. And the board should actually set a development budget to enable that to happen. And if you move to the next slide for us, please. Okay, they can access training through a variety of sources. So, for example, it might be in-school training, so school training from the school leadership team themselves. But there is also the local authority governor training programme. There's the National Governors Association training. There are training packages provided by academy trusts. And there are also a whole series of third-party providers. But there is a very clear expectation on governors that they should develop themselves and develop their skill level so that they can support their school. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, governors are regarded as part of the leadership of the school in terms of Ofsted. And as it clearly says in the middle of that slide, inspectors will seek evidence of the impact of those responsible for governance. And not surprisingly, what inspectors will look at are the three key functions that we started the presentation with, and that it is in respect of those three functions that governors will be questioned by inspectors. Okay, we move to the next slide. There is some support for governors. Some of the detailed legislation in and around governance is almost impenetrable, I have to say. It is really quite difficult. Luckily, the DfE around 5 or 6 years ago produced a governance handbook, which unpicks quite a lot of that statutory framework into a document which is really, really useful in terms of supporting governors in understanding their role. And actually, I would recommend that if you wanted to find out anything about the function of a governing board, the governance handbook is probably the right place to start. And alongside that, there is a competency framework for governance, which describes the knowledge, skills and behaviours that governors need to exhibit to be able to do their job. All of that is aligned with the Academy Funding Handbook, which actually mirrors quite a lot of what that document says as well. Okay, I don't know if there's any further questions. Doesn't seem to be.
No, oh, sorry, I think I'll stop sharing. Have I stopped sharing?
No. No, we can still see it, Karen.
You can still see the presentation? Or just my screen?
Just your screen. Yeah,
okay.
We need to go back to Martin's slides, don't we? Yeah.
Okay, well done.
Okay.
Bear with me, sorry.
Okay, folks, so apologies for that. It's not very good when you're sitting here talking to yourself, really, is it? So the VPN connection dropped out onto the council server, so apologies for that. Okay, so just to recap where we got to then, the vision that we need to see is this idea that our young people are really at the centre of what we do. And we know that we've got some work to do in terms of the way that we work, the way that we modernise, the way that we improve our systems and processes moving forward. What we've done for this year is we've set out 4 key priorities, and you'll get a copy of these slides anyway, so I'm not going to read them all together line by line. The first priority for us is very much about developing that inclusive practice, and what we need to do is move away from the buzzwords that we've got to actually what does that mean at a grassroots level in terms of our day-to-day practice, and That obviously does include a significant contribution from SEND, but also it's important for us to think about the way that we are looking at the meeting the needs of all of our young people. So as well as SEND, we need to look at those who are vulnerable, those who are EHE, elective home educated, those who are missing in education, those within the care system. And obviously we've got the virtual school, which is headed up by Andy Wright, that has over 600 young people within it in terms of those who are within the care system but are part of our education team within the Dudley Borough. And the other thing for us within the inclusive practice is looking at those who are at risk. And sometimes those are the students or young people that we're not really aware of. That could be for a whole plethora of reasons, from a behaviour point of view, from a family point of view, from a poverty point of view. And it's really important that we identify those and actually are in a position to put the support infrastructure in place to make that difference. So inclusive practice is very much about meeting the needs of all of our young people. The second thing, and I started talking about this, was this idea of partnership working, and we need a joined up approach across all of our council teams, across all of our different departments, to make sure that we are impacting change. So how does our school improvement team work with our social care team, with our healthcare team, and the wider community to drive that joined up improvement? So you can't disconnect these out. Inclusion's important, inclusive practice is important, but it will be emphasised by us actually working as a partnership team to develop that improvement and that change. Okay, Karen, next one, please. And then the other two priorities are this idea of innovation and development. We've got to start innovating. We've got to start thinking about doing things differently. We've got to think about the way that we can bring that innovation to change the mindset. And we're looking at different ways of doing that. One of the ideas is that we will develop a CPD network and system very much at grassroots level within our townships, within our learning communities, where we are driving very simple systems and processes that effect change. And then the last priority for this year is about ambition and aspiration. I've said it several times. We're not very good at promoting ourselves in Dudley. We're not very good at thinking about, we've got a lot of good things going on, and a lot of young people go on to do amazing things, and we need to celebrate that success, and we need to stop settling for the fact that we don't think we're very good and accepting it. We need to really push our boundaries. We're going to do a piece of work on looking at our data. We've started that. We're going to look at the data that we've got and how we use that to drive intervention and drive change. And actually, we want to become a pathfinder for all that we do. And we want to become a pathfinder for good practice, for sharing that good practice, and for considering the outcomes that our young people and our children get. And outcomes are far more than what they get at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4. This is about long-term transition into employment, to becoming good citizens, because if we actually start looking at outcomes in its entirety, they become good citizens that then improves our community. So that wider education remit has a big impact on our communities and our neighbourhoods, because it has an impact on crime rates and youth offending and all that kind of thing. So it is about driving that ambition, that aspiration to be whatever you want to be. Last one then, Karen, please. And I think that the point is that I've shared this with numerous people across the education team and wider in the authority and our schools. I'll just leave you with that thought. When President Kennedy visited the NASA headquarters and he met the janitor who was mopping the floor, he said, "And what do you do?" And he said, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." And we need to think about our roles in that wider context of actually impacting our young people. Whatever we do is about changing the life chances and making that difference on a day-to-day basis. That is really, in a nutshell, just a little snapshot of a much wider strategic vision for education, which I'm conscious that many colleagues have already seen, but we'll circulate the slides. I'm more than happy to take any questions or any comments if anybody's got any. I'll take that as a no then. Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's the end of that's it. That's the end of our training. Thank you. We will circulate the slides, and thank you for joining us this evening. And obviously, you know, as we mentioned before, if you can circulate that to your governing bodies, it just raises some awareness there of the role of Schools Forum. Okay, thanks a lot then. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
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 Bye.